Hello, Sparkly Beans, and welcome to the Tarot Study series. We have made it up to the Hierophant, and before I get started, I just want to share a quick announcement, particularly for folks who have been following a while, or maybe you're new and you just enjoy this content and are interested in more on tarot and astrology, or just want to get updates from me. Spiritual essays, personal growth, etc. I am relaunching my email list and moving over to a new format. So I'm really excited about that, and there's going to be a link down there in the description where you can sign up. There is a specific tarot and astrology study list, so you can go ahead and sign up, and then you can opt out of lists. So if you only want to receive tarot and astrology content, you can do that. If you don't want to receive tarot and astrology but want to receive general spiritual content, you can do that. You can opt in and out of different things. So I hope that format works well for you. Generally, you will receive anywhere from 1 to 4 emails a month, depending on what lists you sign up for. And that is the best way to see my long form writing and to get exercises, journal prompts, tarot spreads, etc. So I wanted to make sure all my YouTube fam knows how to get there. Again, I will leave the link below. All right, so let's get started with the Hierophant. First, just a quick couple of little housekeeping notes. One is that if you do enjoy this tarot study series, you may know that it's been fairly intermittent, but I am planning to be doing approximately once a month. So you can expect that this will be coming out more frequently. Of course, there's 78 cards to get through, so, you know, I intend to do them all. It'll just take, 10 years? But we may do them a little more frequently sometimes, so we'll see. But we're covering the Hierophant today, and so one, I just want to note that I will not be showing the traditional Hierophant card with like the Pope on it, just because I know some folks may have religious trauma that could be upsetting. Also, I really feel that like the Pope as the archetype for the Hierophant ignores the destruction, colonization, all the things that the Catholic Church was involved in. Of course, if you are somebody who identifies as or practices Catholicism, this is not meant to be like a personal attack on you, just a recognition that for some folks that imagery may be activating. So normally in the Tarot Study series, I kind of show the standard version of the card. I'm not going to do that this time. Also, I'll be weaving images throughout the video rather than showing them all at the end. So let me know what you think of that style. And the one other thing that I wanted to cover at the top of this was just to note that the Hierophant card was actually our year card collectively in 2021. So depending on when you're watching this, 2021 may have just ended or maybe a while back, but you can kind of think to your year in 2021, and particularly the energies you noticed around you and what was happening kind of globally, but also to your own year, and kind of consider whether some of these themes came up for you. I know that for me, the Hierophant was really present this year, because I'm actually recording this in late December. The Hierophant has been really present for me, and so that could be a useful way to kind of ground into the energy of this card, is just as I'm going over some of the different interpretations and meanings to think about how they might have come up for you in 2021. Okay, so let's get into it. In the Hierophant, we are kind of picking up on some of the structure of the Emperor card, which we have already covered on the series, so I'll try to remember to stick a card up there. You can also just check the series playlist if you haven't seen that already. We talked about the structure with the Emperor, and we are picking up on that in the Hierophant, but we start moving kind of more specifically into structures of language, structures of truth, structures of morality, structures that are spiritual. So the Hierophant is about ritual, it's about tradition and practice. It's also about revelation, not revelations like the Christian Bible, but revelation, as in something kind of being revealed to you, and then communicating that out in some way. It can point to text specifically, so not even necessarily the person, but just like to a text. Um, but also, like, you can think about the Hierophant often makes me think about like poetry, sort of like snippets of word or song or lyrics, that really transport you and deepen your connection to the divine. So I feel Hierophant in the kind of feeling that I get when I read. It's often poetry, but it could be prose. Just like a piece of writing that makes me go, whoa, like I feel connected to something universal, to something true, to something divine. The Hierophant specifically, though, tends to also not just be about the words themselves, but how is the divine interpreted. So if I read something like that gives me that connection, somebody wrote that down, right? So they're interpreting something. So I think about the structure of language itself with this card. Paul Foster Case described the Hierophant as a kind of bridge between the subconscious and the conscious, which is interesting because you have this kind of like act of putting something that you just know, like in your soul, intuitively, you just feel it, you relate to it, that subconscious connection with divine, and then you're putting that into words or practice. So that's where I think we get to like the ritual or tradition side. It can be about words, it can be more about practice. Case talks about that concept of revelation. So as in like if you are familiar with any texts that are like typically these might be scriptures, but also like I think there are some examples that aren't necessarily scripture, but where the author doesn't relate to it as the author, but just as the person who wrote it down. So it could be channeled writing for sure. Anything that kind of comes down and then out onto the page. I find this really resonates for me as somebody who does do like channeled intuitive writing, is that sometimes when I sit down at my computer and I'm getting hit and I'm like, oh, I need to write this down, that words will just kind of flow out. And sometimes they'll be pretty and sometimes they'll be gobbledygook, but it's that kind of channel. I also like to think with this card a little bit about like semiotics. So I'm a bit of a nerd for linguistic stuff and language stuff. And the idea that when you put language to something, that you are categorizing it in some way. So you're starting to put structure around it, like even just by naming something, and then further by creating categories or creating like genres or subjects or whatever, this is dog, but dog is also part of animal, and then animal is part of people, or whatever, categories you put on something really inform. You can even think about actually the fact that I just said, right, animal is part of people, because that's my the way I relate to people is, for me, a person or people includes a stone, a cat, a tree, and that comes from like my belief system, which also structures my language. But it's not always necessarily, it doesn't have to be about like belief or religion or spiritual. If you think about the power of language in society, and this is where I think sometimes the Hierophant, especially the more traditional like Pope version, can make people think of authority or spiritual authority. You can also think about the power of language. So, if we put words on something and those create categories and then those create meaning, you can think about ideas like what is good and what is evil, right? Or more subtly, how our values can kind of be encoded into certain phrases or idioms. So if you think about like money is power, for example, it's just like a common phrase you might hear, money is power, right? What does that say about us as a society? That is like just a phrase that comes off. So the most sacred like expression of the Hierophant might be channeled information or writing that is really divinely connected. But I think there's also a more mundane aspect there of like, how do we put things into language? And I don't think that's a binary, right? Sacred and it's not mundane. What's the opposite of sacred and profane? I don't think that's really a binary, personally. So I think like an example of this in a more like secular sense might be, I think there's really something of the Hierophant in somebody who claims the right to the identity terms that they prefer, that I prefer, that you prefer, even where others find it confusing. So if you think about like pronouns, for example, my pronouns, if you don't know, are Z and here. So if you're not familiar with those, to just use them quickly in a sentence, it would be like, this is Avery, Z goes to the grocery store to pick up here groceries. Or I am talking to here. That's both the object and the possessive. Those pronouns I chose in 2010-ish, I guess. I can never remember exactly when it was, but when I realized, when I learned that non-binary existed and then was like, oh, that's me. And at that time, there was still a lot of like settling. I mean, I think they still are to some extent, but pronouns are really settling for non-binary folks. And so them was actually not as popular as using what are called neo-pronouns like Z and here. And so some people could say I backed the wrong horse, as it were. You know, I got on these pronouns and then everybody now is they, them. But those pronouns now feel like me. I picked those pronouns for a reason. They were the pronouns that felt most like me. And I'm going to keep them, despite the fact that everyone finds them confusing. And despite the fact that I am okay if you call me they, them. That's all right, right? That's much better than using he or she for me. It at least acknowledges that I'm non-binary. But at the same time, when somebody, says, oh, like, have you met here? My heart is like, yeah, you see me, right? And so I think that there is something there in that like way that words can signal recognition and can be really powerful, that is in a way divine almost, even though it is not directly related to like religion or spirituality. Maybe the highest form of the Hierophant is also like reconnecting words to truth. So that feeling of like, total alignment between experience and the words, or feeling in the words, can be part of that. So I'm going to show a few cards that kind of get to this interpretation of the Hierophant. One of my favorites is from the Tarot of the Silicon Dawn, which I'm afraid it's out of print, and the gloss is making this focus a little futzy, but if you can see it, this is the being that is made of what looks like language or code. It's a very like futuristic deck, but it's a being made up of words, and I love that version. Then we have a more sort of just somebody who is working with writing from the Mermaid Tarot. Here's another one. This is the Astara Tarot. So you have you do have a figure, but you can't see their head, and there's actually, there's kind of a disembodied hand. So if you look, you can kind of see that there are eyes in the book itself, and then there's a tree where you would expect a head to be, which I think is really cool. And then you have all these other kind of pages around it. So that's kind of a neat one. Then with the like general structure meaning, I like the Spacious Tarot uses, and of course there's something of the divine here in the Stonehenge. Also maybe a sense of like practice and ritual if you are familiar with Stonehenge, and it's Druidic. I think it was Druidic associations. Okay, this one I really like. So this is from the Way Home. One, it's a mushroom, and if you know me, you know I'm obsessed with mushrooms. So there is this like sense of structure, and you've got roots, and then you've got growing up high. But what I love is when you reverse this Hierophant, it looks like the mushroom is covering their eyes, which I just find really interesting for Hierophant reversed. So there's that. This is from the Tarot of Mystical Moments. So you have this kind of owl wisdom, and the owl telling stories, and then you have this figure sitting on a branch, this young person, and the owl is reading. So that association again with like words and text, but then also the sense of kind of like guidance. So I mentioned tradition, spiritual practice. So, for example, Michelle T in Modern Tarot talks about the Hierophant can be associated with rule-bound groups and situations, with established systems of various kinds, um, and speaks to the card as an encouragement to follow a traditional path. Which I don't know. We'll keep going on this. I with well, we're gonna keep going on it. So I'll just go ahead and like share some of these and then give you my thoughts. Bakara, every time I say is it Ventnor or Wentnor, I need to look this up. But in WTF is a tarot talks about mentorship. So like tradition, but also like mentorship, spiritual guidance, spiritual advisors, and specifically spiritual advisors who act in integrity. So moving away from the kind of like potentially corrupt or potentially like shadowy kind of spiritual authority and more into specifically advisors who are in integrity. Beth at Little Red Tarot talks about the card as an invitation to return to your roots. So people who you admire, people who you're inspired by, but also your ancestors and kind of collective wisdom. Some decks will frame this kind of like guidance or like spiritual advisor sense. Some decks will frame this as a more personal guide. So kind of like a keeper of the keys type vibe. And the Wayfarer guidebook, and here's an image. This is the Wayfarer, so it's actually a professor. The Wayfarer guidebook talks about the Hierophant as an interpreter of sacred mysteries who can act as a guide, but is also ultimately in service to a larger cause and can kind of help you find your path. So I'm actually going to read you a little bit from the Wayfarer guidebook for this Hierophant, which I'll hold here. Tradition is at the heart of the Hierophant, and he seeks to preserve the ways of the world so that they can be passed down. He shows very particular ways to people, depending on their needs, and then hands them their own keys. It is not up to him to walk the path of others, only to point them in the right direction. The key to the universe is within reach, and he is able to utilize it whenever he needs to. Perhaps he has a hidden jar of skeleton keys, one for each person, each as unique as the person that it is meant for. So I love that, and this kind of like professorly figure with the tea and the books behind him, because it really makes me think a little more broadly about this card. So there is, I think, a little bit of a tension sometimes in interpretations between like, does the Hierophant mean spiritual authority and like traditional ways of knowledge, which I don't know that we want to like completely throw out as we get to some other interpretations. But there's a little bit of like a tension between that sense of tradition and ritual and then the sense of like autonomy and figuring out for yourself what those rituals are. And I think the bridge is this kind of like keeper of the keys idea that the Hierophant does represent a need for guidance or support or maybe like tuning into the traditions, whether it's of your ancestors, whether it's of a particular religious tradition, etc., but then also working with them individually and finding your own meaning. I also like the particular kind of professor in the library thing is kind of cool to me because it makes me think about preserving traditions, languages, cultures. So, librarians, archivists, curators make me think of Hierophant in the sense that, traditions can be lost, cultural knowledge can be lost, sometimes not just lost, but like violently taken, of course. And there is a part of collective knowledge is the preservation of that knowledge, is the I'm really nerdy and interested in kind of access to information and how we protect it, and I find it bothersome that in reality this professor probably has access to a lot of materials, at least if it was in the modern world, a lot of materials that people can't get access to unless they're academics, right? So I'm very into like open source publishing and finding ways to make knowledge accessible, which I think is part of the highest form of the Hierophant would be being an advocate for access to knowledge. You know, what we choose to save and what we don't, assuming that we are at choice and not having tradition stolen from us. But like, it says a lot about us as a people. You're probably familiar with the idea that history is typically told from the perspective of the victors. So that lies within all of this. You know, the preservation of indigenous languages comes up here. The sort of some of the more violent practices around assimilation, which I'm not going to talk about in detail here because I think that would require a separate content warning, and I want folks to be able to watch this video without that activation, but I might do a video on it in the future. In any event, also I think of like oral traditions and the importance of storytelling and oral history, like in indigenous contexts and more broadly, just that like storytelling is an interesting tradition because a transmitted story kind of adapts to context. Like it adapts to whom it's being told by and to whom and what's around them. And the story itself, even if the core of it remains, can be shaped over time. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more as well. But some other examples of this kind of guidance thing. So this like keeper of the keys idea, this is from Tarot in Space. And I like that this figure both has kind of like multiple eyes. So there's this idea of like seeing it from multiple perspectives and then holding, again, the keys. You can see as like a guide. Then just the naming of this one. This is from the Light Series. The Keeper of the Sacred is, I just absolutely adore the energy of this Hierophant. Because sometimes the Hierophant can be kind of stuffy in cards. And I love this laughing, really at ease. So you can see this, the stairs kind of like feels like leading up to the mandala. It feels like a path. But then I just love the like laughing. Like this is the guide I would want to have with me. But the Keeper of the Sacred makes me think of that Keeper of the Keys. I also want to show the Queen of Wands from the same deck because I feel like there's a resonance between these two in terms of their laughing, their posture, the sky. And I love that because the Queen of Wands, the Queen of Wands to me, and we'll get to that card maybe one day, but the Queen of Wands to me is very much about your own personal magic. So when I paired these together, I think about the Keeper of the Sacred kind of being able to tune into each person's magic. Or maybe the Queen of Wands is the Keeper of the Sacred. Maybe we are all the Keeper of the Sacred. Just kind of a segue into the next thing we'll be talking about. I also want to show the Messenger from, this is the Hierophant equivalent in the next world. So you can see this kind of transmitting of knowledge, you know, somebody speaking at a protest event, I think is really cool. There's also this like, makes me think about values, and values are very much a part of the Hierophant, which is associated with, actually see the correspondences at the bottom, associated with Taurus. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit as well. And then the Visionary from the Numinous Tarot also has this kind of sense of the guide. In this case, kind of going within to consult their own wisdom. From the Tarot of the Crone, it's renamed Tradition, and we have the Matryoshkas. And I love the Matryoshkas because it makes me think of how wisdom can build up over time. And like I said, be adapted, but also like each, you know, holds each other. And so it's like you've got your ancestry backing you up, but each form is a little bit different. And then finally, this is from, this might get me in trouble if I say, because I know that YouTube can be weird. I'm going to say, whatever, you know what, screw censorship. It's Sluttus Tarot, and this is the Mother. So I think this is really interesting if you think about parents as like transmitting knowledge and being kind of the keeper of values until the child, I mean, hopefully only until the child is old enough to have some autonomy in themselves and like figure out their own path. But, you know, a mother serving as a kind of spiritual guide or like guide to values. Often, you know, a parent may teach a child how to read, how to access language, what language means, and then the child will come to make their own interpretations. But I think that's a really interesting choice. Okay, so let's get a little more into like the spiritual autonomy side of the Hierophant. So like I said, like ancestors, collective wisdom, mentors, teachers, all of this can come up. Different forms of guidance can come up. But ultimately, I think it's really about spiritual autonomy. I think that you are your own Hierophant. And even if the card, particular deck you're using, points more to tradition and ritual, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's that the pulling the card means you must stick with tradition and ritual. Now, it might indicate it's time to like check in with or make reference to tradition or ritual, but it might also mean it's time to create your own or time to adapt those things. Tradition, you know, can be supportive, but some of the guidebooks I least like are the ones that will say things about the Hierophant like, you don't know the answer. Like I literally saw, I can't remember which, but there was a guidebook that was like, this, when you pull this card, it means you don't know the answer. And yes, there are sometimes cards where like the idea is you don't know yet, like chill. But I don't like that interpretation for the Hierophant because it feels like literally the opposite. You know, Taurus, we mentioned that Taurus is associated with the Hierophant. Taurus is one of the things Taurus is about. So Taurus is one of the signs ruled by Venus in Hellenistic astrology. And when I think of Venus, and particularly Taurus side of Venus, I think about personal values. Not that they can't be shared, but it is very much an energy of getting to understand and be grounded in and be sure and steady earth sign, right? Fixed earth in our values. And that's not to say that they can adapt. And of course, you know, a healthy value system is always checking against its environment and figuring out if those are the right values. Right values. There's no right values, but those are the values that resonate. But it's you know, Venus is still a personal planet and still, I think, requires a certain degree of personal reflection. It's not just about the values of the collective. You know, some folks do find this card difficult, right? Because it can bring up organized religion and a traditional interpretation. And so I like interpretations that go more into your own wisdom. So Lindsay Mack, for example, teaches this card as something that, you know, can point to a need to like examine your beliefs, your inherited beliefs, your cultural beliefs, where they come from and whether they're true. It doesn't mean that they're all not true. It just means, you know, that when you pull this card, you might want to think about, like around the question or situation that I'm asking the tarot about, what beliefs do I have? And, you know, what are their origins? Do they feel true to me? And you can look at inherited beliefs from all different kinds of systems, not just religion. So family beliefs, cultural beliefs, your education, what you learned in school, beliefs of your chosen family, you know, anything really. And similarly to Lindsay, Sarah Chappell talked in her Tarot for Self-Care class about how when you pull the Hierophant, you really want to look at the beliefs that are involved with the question. So like, what are the expectations you might have for the area of life you're looking into? So do you think that like career and work need to look a certain way? Do you think relationships need to look a certain way? Sarah talks about that. And again, like some of those beliefs may be supporting you and might stay, but others might be up for review. And then the Herb Crafters Tarot, the guidebook talks about the availability of the sacred to everyone, and about like opening your heart up to authentic spiritual teachings and trusting your divine timing. So I think I will read you from that. So here's first of all, this is the card. So the Hierophant is cacao in the Herb Crafters. So there's the card. And I will show it again after I read, but I'm just going to read the guidebook entry from the Herb Crafters about the Hierophant. A revelation is at hand. Seek the truth in spiritual teachings. The most potent wisdom emerges from the heart. A clay pot of ceremonial cacao sits on an ancestral tapestry decorated with pink primrose blossoms. A basalt mortar holds roasted cacao beans, a cinnamon stick, and chili. A replica of an ancient incense burner in the shape of a woman emerging from a hill of cacao rests on a pile of raw beans and unopened pods. A decorative molinillo lies on the tapestry, having already stirred and frothed the walnut brown elixir. The secrets of the sacred are available to all. Learn them. Teach them. Drinking pure cacao is an ancient practice that leads to greater perceptive awareness by opening the heart. Commercial chocolate is cacao stripped of its beneficial properties, cloaked in delicious yet harmful ingredients. Only true cacao can open the capillaries and increase blood flow. Spiritual teaching must speak authentically to reach the heart, but some things must be revealed slowly. As too much cacao can cause the pulse to quicken, learning too much too fast can overwhelm. Have patience with the pace of the divine. Remain devoted to mystery, yet have respect for ceremony. So I love the way this really kind of ties in those both sides, where it's, devoted to mystery, yet respect for ceremony. It brings in the tradition and the ritual and like the spiritual practice in working with cacao in a traditional way. But it also talks about the heart-oriented nature and the fact that the secrets of the sacred are available to all. So it's not necessarily about like this pope or whatever figure who tells you what's up. It's about everybody going in internally and trusting themselves and getting to know their own beliefs. So I think it's really important in spiritual space to question your teachers, come up with interpretations. I think the best teachers encourage this for sure. And that's like sort of part of what I'm doing with this series, right? Is I'm walking through different teachers for you and different interpretations, and then I'm giving my own. And I want to really encourage you that if you don't agree with my interpretations, or you are like, no, I actually kind of like the more traditional Hierophant, then great, right? That's your wisdom. So you get to be your own teacher with the tarot. So just a couple of more cards to kind of emphasize this like personal connection with the divine, or the idea of like multiple sources. So this is from the Tarot Lubanco, and I like the way, so you'll notice that this figure, we've got multiple hands and we have this mask. And I think this card kind of emphasizes the idea that that truth can come from multiple sources, and that it's good to kind of look at multiple sources and question and come up with your own wisdom. And then this is from the Tarot of the Holy Spectrum. And here, I like the way the kind of voices of divine, the outlined figures, and this imagery repeats in this deck, so the outlined figures tend to be kind of divine, or guide, spirit, are directly whispering in the ear of the figure. So it's a reminder that you don't necessarily need a mediator. Although, again, like, well, I want to respect that some folks' traditions, like the mediator or the guide, is very important. And when we looked at like that keeper of the keys, I think having a teacher or a guide or support can be really supportive. Like, but for me, the Hierophant is when those two things come together. So as an example, I mentioned Lindsay Mack a lot in my videos because she has kind of been my primary tarot teacher, although I've looked at different sources and taken some classes from others. But one of the things I really love about her is that her whole shtick is like, don't listen to me. Like, here's everything. I'm going to give you all my wisdom, and then you go and you do study with the cards yourself. And I think that's why, actually, like, one of the big reasons why she appeals to me as a teacher. And what I want to be as a teacher myself is that when I share tarot or astrology, that I want folks to do the same thing. I don't think I would have gotten to a lot of the places I've gotten with the tarot on my own without that support system. In fact, the very first deck I ever bought, Tarot of the Starry Cauldron, it's a great deck. It's a beautiful deck, but the creator was very much like, this is intuitive. You don't need to know tarot. Like, the whole thing is just intuition. I was like, great. And then I got it and was like, ugh. in part because of my own, like, I don't know, I tend to access spirituality and creativity very much through structure, which is what I like about the tarot, is that it's a set structure of 78 cards that you can learn. And sometimes I tip a little bit too much. Like sometimes I realize, oh, I'm not even looking at these images. I'm just relying on my interpretations. And then I might tip back towards, let's do this super loosey-goosey. But there's still a structure, a system there. And so I think like sometimes finding our way to spiritual truth can very much be involved in reading tradition, in ritual, in working with a mentor or a guide. And that's beautiful and that's great. And part of that is that when you have that guidance and you have that support, it's helping you to find your own truth. And that we all have the ability inside us to find our own truth. And to find universal truth and to find different faces of that truth. So one other card I'm just going to show, and it doesn't really tie in with any of the stuff I've specifically talking about, but I just think it's interesting, is the Osho Zen. It's no thingness, like nothingness, but there's a hyphen, no thingness. It's literally black. There's nothing there. It's a void. Which, don't get me started on black and white and good and bad, but because that's some racism, kids. But void, right? Void in particular here. No thingness. And in the book, it has kind of like Buddhist references, and that is not my spiritual belief system, so I can't really speak to it. But I do think it's interesting to think about the void of like when there's nothing else there, when there's nothing around us, like nothing physical around us, like what is truth? What is true? And some traditions, I think, do speak to this in the idea of spiritual practice. So get back to like the meaning around spiritual practice. Spiritual practice can be about clearing away, or at least like, putting in context and tending to ego, mind, and external distractions and all these different like chatter that we have with our big complex brains, and not necessarily dismissing those, but like for some, spiritual practice is about clearing out those filters somewhat, or putting them to the side so that we can find the truth that's there in the dark. So that's an interesting interpretation. And to that, by the way, to specific like spiritual practices, Luna y Flor talks about Hierophant as being about like practical spirituality or spirituality in action, which I think is interesting. So when you think about spiritual practice, this card may come up when you're seeking more kind of ritual specific practice, whether it's tradition or creating your own. But I think a lot about ritual with this card, and particularly like personally meaningful ritual. So, it could be family tradition, it could be chosen family tradition, it could be a particular school of thought or like type of study that you do that's part of your spiritual practice. Meadow Queen Tarot also talks about this card as having a justice element, but specifically it's unlike the justice card, it's justice or protection specifically for those in the group of the Hierophant. So I think there can be this element of like the group or a specific tradition, but I think it's important to note the shadow side of that, and like I would never think of the Hierophant as like a cult leader, right? But that might be what's interesting is I think sometimes folks would think of the Hierophant as being like could be like an abuse of spiritual authority, but to me it's like the risk of not being in Hierophant, like the risk of not kind of coming back to what are the beliefs around this and are they true and do I vibe with them, but instead just kind of following a spiritual authority with total gentleness and understanding for folks who are in that place or have recently been in that place. My heart like totally goes to you and is holding space for that experience. I want to be clear on that, but that can be a very painful experience, and that can lead us down a tough path. I think the most sort of well-integrated, divine, healthy forms of being in group practice spiritually are incorporate each individual's experience and each individual's truth. And we've been talking a lot about tradition, but I think it's also important to pull in an element of sustainability, or like what is tradition over time? Like, how does tradition expand and contract and adapt over time? I've been doing a reread of Emergent Strategy, which is a book that's really informed my work. And intentional adaptation is one of the principles of Emergent Strategy, which is all about being able to adapt to shifting circumstances and doing so from a point of intention, a point of purpose. Because when we don't, we can be really reactive because we don't know what we're reacting from. So when change comes up, we can be like, oh, I gotta go this way, I gotta go this way. You could also think about the wheel card, right? Which we'll get to fairly soon. That, you know, if we're really caught up in the wheel, if we're really caught up in all the external motion, then we don't always know how to adapt in a healthy way. But if we have a purpose and we're always filtering through our purpose and we're always being intentional about it, then we can move with the waves, and there will always be waves, right? Like the herb crafters talked about divine timing. You know, timing and time, in my view, and spiritual experience is a spiral. And so with a spiral, you have times that feel harder and times that feel easier, but you're always learning and you're always moving forward and forward like this. You know, I think about, like, astrology is a great example, actually, of a tradition that is a very long and multiple traditions, right, that have existed for thousands and thousands of years. And then there's multiple layers, like both in terms of there being a lot of different traditions that intersect and overlap and sometimes don't with each other, but also, I mean, astrology itself is all about cycles. You're always learning and always teaching and always, you know, like with the spiral, you might be expanding in one place and contracting in another. I think astrology holds that. I think the ways that we like different pieces of astrology are interpreted differently in context over time comes up here, and the same for tarot. I think of astrology, I guess, just because it's so old and it has so much relevance in so many cultures. Where tarot is a little less like that, but I think tarot as well, right? Tarot evolves and expands and grows over time. I mentioned earlier, like oral traditions. Oral traditions tend to evolve and survive pretty long. One, because they're not dependent on printing in physical books, but also because they're living and they're growing. They're adapting with a culture. You can also think about tree wisdom. I am so into trees, and I am a literal tree hugger, except I don't hug them, but I kind of lean up against them. I love trees, and I've been learning more and more about trees, and just the wisdom of trees and the way they can adapt and like hold information, and like when the season is not going to be great or the season's going to be great, like they adapt how they take in resources and distribute resources to the rest of the tree and then to the rest of the ecosystem. And they hold each other, which is brilliant. The roots literally hold each other so that they're more resilient than one alone. You know, we mentioned Taurus, and the thing about Taurus, like, a Taurus can get a little bit stubborn sometimes about something that they love that's kind of old and beaten up, because a Taurus can really get like attracted, especially to something that when they first got it, like it was really high quality. You know, Tauruses love quality, love well-made things, and so might really like hold on to something, and they might have that old comfy couch that's like ready to go. But, you know, despite the stubbornness, it's like if that couch is no longer comfortable, if that quality is gone, then the Taurus, I think, can move on, right? Because they're looking for something with those qualities. And there's a wisdom there in the way that storytelling and like traditions and texts and things survive or don't over time. Unfortunately, sometimes when something like violence intervenes, that's less of like the story was not useful and more people are terrible, but colonizers are terrible. But like there's also a sense with stories left alone, as it were, or not with that kind of violent intervention, where a story will adapt and evolve and sometimes fade out over time because it's not so much as relevant to the context. And I think there is a Taurus quality to that. if you do kind of like with the, and maybe this comes up sometimes in the reversal, like if there is something that you're kind of keeping a dead thing around because you want it around, like maybe that's a little bit of the shadow side, or the you could even say the Scorpio side, although I don't like thinking of opposite signs. And if you're interested in astrology, I'm going to be dropping a practical astrology once a month as well. But I don't think of the opposites as being like this is good and this is bad. They're very much an integration, but Scorpio energy can be kind of like obsessed with the dead and the dying, and like wanting to get to the very bottom of things. And one possible characteristic of that could be a kind of like stuck in scarcity or having trouble releasing something that isn't serving. Even if you don't think of Scorpio that way, you could think of, because by the way, I love Scorpio, just to be clear, I've got some Scorpio in my chart. You could also think of like the Eight of Cups card, if you're familiar with the Eight of Cups. That kind of like, you've got to let something go, but it's hard and you're gripping to it. Or you think about the Chariot, which a little more neutrally like looks at tools that we have, and we're going to cover that very soon, that card. But the tools that we have, and are those tools serving us? And sometimes there are tools that have been serving us but can't keep us going. So it might be that there's a practice or a tradition or a ritual or story that really spoke to you when you were younger. It doesn't work now. Have you ever read a book that was like your favorite when you were 12 or 16 or 25, and then you're like, oh, this isn't resonant. I remember this being magical. It's not magical. The thing is, it was magical at that moment, right? Like, stories are not always meant to follow us throughout our lives, but they can serve us at a particular time. So in the year we've had, in the Hierophant year, you may have noticed some of this, like, you can think about your own life and some of the beliefs and the rituals and the traditions that have come up for you, and maybe what you've decided to keep and what you've decided to not keep. You can also look around you. We've noticed like a lot of people have been challenging conventional wisdom about work, about parenting, as we move another year into this whole thing, finish out another year of this whole thing. It's like there is a lot of us have been sort of forced to confront expectations and stories and beliefs that we had about something that we realize don't hold up in this period of crisis. How we do family, how we travel, like all of these things are kind of being rewritten right now, but a possible way to use this energy is to come back to intuition, is to come back to center. So for me, for example, if you've been following like on Instagram, and I'm going to be writing about stuff like this in the newsletter in the future, so again, sign up for the newsletter below. But on my Instagram, I've written a lot in December and January about the stories that I'm unwriting around resources and the idea that money makes you secure, and realizing that it's actually relationships that make you secure. I read in 2021, I spent almost the entire year reading this book, Sacred Economics, which is largely framed around a collective, like civilization-wide story of constant growth and ascent, and how we're at a tipping point where we need to change that story to one of union and reunion, and taking care of our planet, right? So that's an example of like a big collective story, the story or idea that it's possible to just grow forever. We're realizing is false, hopefully. Also, like a quick note. Well, actually, I want to say one more thing about Taurus, and I'm going to say something about numerology. No, I'm going to say something about numerology and then Taurus. So the numerology, the Hierophant is the card 5 in the major arcana. And I had a couple thoughts on this. One was that, so I've been interested in like tarot math, which isn't really like a specific thing, but some people find interesting. And I've been thinking about, with like numerology, you're adding digits. So this isn't like, I guess, straight up numerology, but 5 does hold 2 and 3, right? 2 and 3 equals 5. And so if 2 is about intuition and 3 is about building, or like, starting to make a stable structure, like a 3-legged stool can stand, then I think about the Hierophant representing a kind of taking in information, listening, reading, hearing the words of a guide or a tradition or a family or whatever, like all these inherited things we take in over time. And then from that place, building and speaking as the 3. So figuring out a reaction to those beliefs. Or it could be the act we talked about, like channeled writing, the actual like act of having that divine revelation is about like taking it in intuitively or through whatever channel and then letting it out as a 3. So I think that's interesting how 2 and 3 make the 5. 5 also can represent like I read this somewhere, but now I can't remember where, so apologies. But a kind of like crisis of faith. Because if you know the 5s in the minor arcana, which we'll again talk about later, but if you think about those, they tend to be kind of tough moments and conflicts, crises. And again, like what I was just saying about where we are collectively this past year comes to this as well. It's like when you have a literal crisis, sometimes your faith is tested, and you come to learn what you really believe. So I think that comes from the number 5. And then finally, I'll just say again about Taurus is that, I think about like Taurus is a very stable energy. It's fixed earth. And we talked about the Emperor. We talked about kind of the Empress, like is creation and generation, but like very wild. It can be like this wild, uncultivated thing. And then the Emperor kind of creates structure and cultivates, and it's like, okay, these plants. And I think about the Emperor building things for the Hierophant to then administer and maintain. So, like in some ways, the number 5 is about, does something stand up to stress testing? Like if you hit this conflict and this difficulty, right, does it stand up? And the way lasting beliefs actually come out of standing up to stress testing is interesting to think about. And finally, the last thing I'll say about the astrology is that, like, if you think about Taurus versus Libra, so the 2 signs that Venus rules, with Taurus, I think a lot about like self-love and autonomy and like your own sort of embodied pleasure. And then with Libra, I think of a more universal love or an outward-facing love. I think of, Libra is associated with the Justice card. So I had mentioned, I think, Meadow Queen Tarot talking about Hierophant justice versus justice. And I don't know that I would totally agree that it's like justice for the group versus justice for everyone. But I think there is something here about like, in order to have universal love, compassionate love for everyone, there's also self-love and there's also tuning into the self and determining one's own beliefs. Being your own wise knowing, your own guide. Taking in, but then like testing that against your intuition. And that if you're not used to doing that kind of practice of testing things against your intuition, that can be kind of hard or scary, or your brain can be like, okay, let's make a pros cons list. But just taking time, and again, this is where the ritual comes up, taking time, maybe it's just sitting on the ground for 5 minutes a day and kind of just being like, I want to connect to my center, I want to come in, I want to ground down, can be a good practice. Okay, so I think that covers the Hierophant. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them below. Again, I encourage you to sign up for my newsletter. And if you do find value in this content, I also have a Patreon link below. The newsletter and my YouTube are where I do all my long form content, and it's a lot. I try to bring you all a lot of value. And so if you are able, and if you find value, and only if you are able and find value, I encourage you to contribute. We have lots of levels all the way from $1 a month up. I am currently running a special deal where if you are an early supporter at the $10 level, you sign up by March 2nd, then I will give you the monthly quarterly report, which is a long video where I pull in like channeled energies, give you an update on my business for the quarter, but also just bring in different tarot astrology, pull some cards, and kind of talk about where we are once a quarter, along with some little discounts and other opportunities to hear first about things. But so we do have the opportunity for that, but also if you want to give it a different level, you're totally encouraged to do so. And I keep all of the actual content available to everyone. Everything except that quarterly video is freely available. So if you did enjoy this, also go ahead and share it with a friend, let somebody know, or forward them the newsletter sign up link, because I am really passionate about building a community of folks who believe in an emerging future and finding their role in it through self-discovery and tools like tarot and astrology. So let's continue on, and I'll see you in the next video on the lovers.